Picture, if you will, a sweltering summer night in Rome. The year is 1943. In a Renaissance palace at the heart of the ancient city, 28 men file into a room, knowing that before dawn breaks, they will either save Italy or sign their own death warrants. The man they're about to judge sits at the head of the table. Benito Mussolini, the founder of fascism, the dictator who had ruled Italy with an iron fist for more than 2 decades. But on this night, something extraordinary is about to happen. Not a coup in the streets, not a popular uprising. Something far more intimate, more chilling, a betrayal from within. This is the story of how Mussolini fell, not to his enemies, but to his friends. To understand what drove these men to turn on their leader, we need to step into their shoes and feel the weight of the world they inhabited in the summer of 1943. Imagine being an Italian that year. 3 years earlier, Mussolini had strut onto the balcony of Palazzo Venezia, his jaw thrust forward in that characteristic pose, and declared war on France and Britain. "We are going in," he had thundered. Italy would stand beside Hitler's Germany. Victory would be swift and glorious. The Mediterranean would become, once again, an Italian lake, Mare Nostrum, as the Romans had called it. But everything had gone catastrophically wrong. North Africa, that promised jewel, was lost. At El Alamein, at Tunisia, Italian soldiers had been routed. Hundreds of thousands now languished in prisoner-of-war camps. The defeats weren't just military, they were humiliating. Italian generals complained bitterly that German officers treated them like errand boys, not allies. And now the war had come home. On July 10th, Allied forces had stormed ashore in Sicily, not some distant colonial outpost, but Italian soil, the homeland itself. British, American, and Canadian troops were pushing inland, and Italian defenses were crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. Worse still, the cities were being bombed. Night after night, the sirens wailed. Milan, Turin, Naples, all had felt the fury of Allied bombers. But nothing shocked the nation quite like the raid on Rome itself, just 5 days before our story begins. Rome, the eternal city, sacred seat of the papacy, had never been touched in modern warfare. Until July 19, 1943. That morning, over 500 American bombers had droned over the city and dropped their payloads. The district of San Lorenzo was devastated. Thousands died. Even the basilica was damaged. Pope Pius himself walked through the rubble, his white cassock stained with blood and dust. The psychological impact was staggering. If Rome wasn't safe, nowhere was. In the streets, people whispered, carefully, fearfully, but they whispered. The magic was broken. The douche who had promised glory had delivered only death and ruin. Bread was scarce. Sons and fathers weren't coming home. The factories stood idle for want of coal and steel. The people were exhausted, angry, and afraid. And what of Mussolini himself? If you had seen him in those final days, you might not have recognized the bombastic figure who once held crowds spellbound. He was 60 years old, but looked older. His face was sallow, his eyes haunted by chronic pain. Those who knew him whispered about stomach ulcers, about sleepless nights, about a man whose body was finally rebelling against decades of stress and excess. Just 5 days earlier, he had traveled north to the little town of Feltre for a meeting with Adolf Hitler. It was meant to be a conference between equals, between allies. Mussolini had prepared carefully. He would tell Hitler honestly, Italy could not go on. They needed German troops diverted from Russia. Perhaps they could negotiate a separate peace with Stalin, turn all their might against the Western allies. Something, anything, had to change. But when the two dictators met, Hitler did what Hitler always did. He talked. For 3 solid hours. He lectured Mussolini like a schoolmaster berating a disappointing pupil. He offered no reinforcements, no strategic shifts, only endless words about destiny and willpower. Mussolini sat silent, diminished, too weary even to interrupt. When he returned to Rome, those close to him saw a broken man. Yet, and here's where the story becomes truly fascinating, it was Mussolini himself who called the Grand Council of Fascism to meet. This was the supreme body of the regime, at least in theory. 28 of the most powerful men in fascist Italy, ministers, party bosses, military chiefs. But the council hadn't met since December of 1939, nearly 4 years earlier. Under Mussolini's dictatorship, it had become mere decoration, a rubber stamp gathering dust. Why summon it now? Some historians believe Mussolini thought a show of unity would strengthen his hand with the Germans. Others think he genuinely sought advice, though he'd never needed it before. A few suspect he had become so disconnected from reality that he simply didn't see the danger. Perhaps exhaustion had clouded his famous instinct for power. Whatever the reason, he had set in motion forces he could no longer control. Enter Count Dino Grandi, a name you should remember, for he was about to become the protagonist in one of history's most dramatic palace intrigues. Grandi was, in many ways, cut from different cloth than the thugs and opportunists who often surrounded Mussolini. He came from old stock, an aristocrat from Romagna, one of the original squadristi who had marched on Rome in 1922. He'd served as foreign minister, as ambassador to London. He knew the world beyond Italy. He knew Britain, spoke English, understood that the war was lost. And Grandi had reached a conclusion. Italy must be saved, even if that meant sacrificing Mussolini. In the weeks leading up to that fateful meeting, Grandi worked in secret, crafting what he called an order of the day, essentially a resolution that would strip Mussolini of his military authority and restore it to King Victor Emmanuel III. It was cleverly worded, never overtly attacking fascism itself, but aimed squarely at Mussolini's personal control. The war could continue, they would pledge loyalty to the crown, but the Duce would be sidelined. Grandi circulated his proposal quietly, feeling out potential supporters. He found them. Giuseppe Bottai, the sophisticated Minister of Education who kept a detailed diary, our window into these events. Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's own son-in-law, the former foreign minister who had opposed the German alliance and now feared for his life. Emilio de Bono, one of the original 4 leaders of the March on Rome, now old and disillusioned. But there were hardliners too. Roberto Farinacci, a fanatical pro-German who ran his fiefdom in Cremona like a medieval warlord. Carlo Scorza, the party secretary, loyal to the end. These men would defend the Duce. The vote, Grandi knew, would be close. The meeting was called for 5 o'clock in the evening of July 24th at Palazzo Venezia, that massive Renaissance pile that had become synonymous with Mussolini's power. From its balcony, he had harangued the crowds. In its grand rooms, he had received kings and ambassadors. But as the hierarchs began arriving that summer evening, Rome itself seemed to hold its breath. The heat was oppressive. Another air raid had struck that morning, smaller than the 19th, but a reminder that death could fall from the sky at any moment. The streets were quiet under blackout regulations. Windows were covered. People hurried home, staying off the streets after dark. Grandi arrived early. In his briefcase, hidden beneath papers, he carried 2 hand grenades. This detail, from his own later testimony, tells us everything about the atmosphere of that evening. He didn't know if Mussolini might order their arrest. He didn't know if the meeting would end in their execution. The grenades were a last resort. If soldiers came to drag him away, he'd take his enemies with him. Think about that for a moment. These weren't revolutionaries storming the Bastille. These were government ministers arriving at a routine meeting, and one of them was bringing explosives. It speaks to just how far trust had eroded, how poisonous the atmosphere had become. The 28 members gathered in the Sala del Pappagallo, the Parrot Room, an ante-room adjoining Mussolini's cavernous office, with its famous oversized desk and massive globe. Someone noted that for the first time in memory, no stenographer was present. No official record would be kept. Whatever happened in that room would be witnessed only by the men present, remembered only in their competing, contradictory accounts. Mussolini arrived nearly 2 hours late, around 7:15. He looked terrible, pale, drawn, moving slowly. Some thought he seemed drugged. Others said he was simply exhausted. He carried a folder of papers, military reports he believed would justify his conduct of the war, rally the wavering to his side. The session began with the practical matters. Military commanders gave reports on Sicily. The news was uniformly grim. Italian divisions were melting away. The Germans were fighting hard, but treating Italian commanders with contempt. Complaints were aired, carefully, tentatively at first, about how Germany had used Italy, taken its resources, given nothing in return. But everyone in that smoke-filled room knew these were preliminaries. The real business of the night lay ahead. Around 10 o'clock, after nearly 3 hours of circling the real issue, Dino Grandi stood up. In his hand was the resolution he had drafted weeks earlier. Now was the moment of truth. Grandi was a practiced speaker, but on this night, he spoke with particular care. For more than an hour, he laid out his case, choosing every word deliberately, knowing that one false note could cost him his life. He invoked Italy's great past, not just the Roman glory that the fascists loved to parade, but the constitutional monarchy that had unified the country in the 19th century. He spoke of the king, that small, elderly man who had reigned since 1900, but had always stood in Mussolini's shadow. It was time, Grandi argued, for the crown to resume its rightful role. The nation was in danger. Traditional institutions must be restored. The king should assume direct military command, as the Statuto, Italy's constitution, provided. But notice his cleverness. Grandi never attacked fascism directly. He expressed loyalty to the war effort. He framed everything in terms of saving Italy, not destroying the regime. The motion was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, surgical, precise, aimed at one man. Mussolini listened, slumped in his chair. Occasionally, he interrupted with bitter little comments. "You want to turn back the clock," he muttered at one point. But the fire was gone. The man who had once dominated every room he entered now seemed almost a spectator at his own funeral. Giuseppe Bottai, watching carefully, scribbled notes that would later become his famous diary. He recorded the oppressive atmosphere, the room thick with cigarette smoke, men rising to pace because they couldn't sit still, the muffled sounds of the blacked-out city beyond the windows. Every face was tense, calculating. Everyone knew they were making history, but no one knew yet what kind. Other speakers rose. Roberto Farinacci, predictably, proposed a counter-motion calling for even closer ties with Germany, for total war to the bitter end. A few others defended Mussolini, but their speeches lacked conviction. You could hear it in their voices. They were going through the motions, paying lip service to a man whose power was already slipping away. Carlo Scorza, the party secretary, gave a passionate defense of the douche, but even he seemed to understand he was fighting a losing battle. The wind had shifted. In that room on that night, the truth was becoming undeniable. Mussolini's star had fallen. Then came perhaps the most poignant moment of the evening. Palazzo Ciano rose to speak. Imagine the scene. A son-in-law standing to speak against his wife's father. The man who had raised him up, given him power, made him foreign minister at the age of 33. Ciano was married to Etta, Mussolini's beloved daughter, the one child who had her father's steel in her spine. Ciano's speech was brief. He wasn't a natural conspirator like Grandi, but his support for the resolution was clear and devastating. Here was someone from the innermost circle, from the family itself, breaking away. Mussolini must have felt it like a dagger, but his face showed little. Was it stoicism, resignation, shock? We'll never truly know. Ciano's own motives were complex, partly principle, partly self-preservation. He had opposed the German alliance from the start, had seen the disaster coming, but he also knew that Mussolini's hardline allies, men like Farinacci, wanted him dead. If Mussolini fell, Ciano might survive. If Mussolini clung to power, Ciano's days were numbered. As it turned out, both calculations were wrong. Ciano would survive Mussolini's fall by only a few months before facing a firing squad in Verona. But on this night, he couldn't see that future. He could only make his choice and hope. The debate stretched on. Midnight came and went. Men grew increasingly exhausted, their arguments becoming repetitive, their voices hoarse. The smoke in the room must have been nearly unbearable. Outside, Rome slept fitfully in the summer heat, unaware that inside this palace, the fate of the nation was being decided. Finally, around 2:30 in the morning, with dawn just a few hours away, someone called for a vote. The method was simple. Those in favor of Grandi's resolution would stand. Those opposed would remain seated. One by one, the hierarchs made their choice. Some stood quickly, decisively. Others hesitated, looking around the room, trying to gauge which way the wind was blowing. A few calculated to the very last second, standing only when they saw they'd be in the majority. When the count was tallied, the result was clear. 19 in favor, 7 against, with a few abstentions and absences. Not overwhelming, but definitive. The Grand Council of Fascism had voted to remove Mussolini's military authority. For a long moment, Mussolini said nothing. He simply sat there, staring at the men who had just repudiated him. What was going through his mind? Rage? Disbelief? A kind of bitter vindication that his suspicions about loyalty had always been correct? When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost matter of fact. You have provoked a crisis of the regime. That was it. No threats, no bluster. He gathered his papers, adjourned the meeting, and left the room. The men filed out into the Roman dawn, many of them hardly able to believe what they'd just done. Some went home to wait, to see what would happen. Others fled the city immediately, sensing that blood would flow before this was finished. They had toppled the douche, but they had not yet answered the crucial question, what came next? If the vote surprised Mussolini, what followed the next day shocked him even more. July 25th dawned hot and clear. Mussolini, apparently convinced that the Grand Council's vote was merely advisory, went to his office at Palazzo Venezia and worked through the morning. He had a scheduled audience with King Victor Emmanuel at 5 o'clock that afternoon. He'd had hundreds of such meetings over the years. The king had always been pliant, weak, eager to avoid confrontation. Mussolini expected reassurance, perhaps even support. Instead, he got the surprise of his life. The meeting took place at Villa Savoia, the royal residence in the northern outskirts of Rome. It lasted barely 20 minutes. The king, a tiny man, barely 5 feet tall, always immaculate in his military uniform, came straight to the point with uncharacteristic firmness. My dear douche, the king said, things are no longer working. The soldiers don't want to fight anymore. The Grand Council's vote is terrifying. You are the most hated man in Italy. I must ask you to resign. Marshal Badoglio will form a new government. Mussolini, stunned, tried to argue. The vote, he insisted, was merely consultative. He was still the legal head of government, but the king cut him off. The decision was made. The audience was over. In shock, Mussolini left the villa. As he approached his car, he was suddenly surrounded by carabinieri officers. Captain Paolo Vinieri, polite but firm, informed him that he was under arrest. For your own protection, they said. To avoid creating a scene, they placed him in an ambulance rather than a police car and drove away. The man who had ruled Italy for 21 years, who had met with Hitler and Churchill, who had sent armies across 3 continents, that man was now a prisoner, traveling in an ambulance through the streets of Rome, heading toward an uncertain fate. By evening, the news was everywhere. The radio crackled with the announcement Mussolini had resigned. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, an elderly military figure untainted by close association with the regime, was now prime minister. The king had acted. What happened next was perhaps the most revealing thing of all. The regime that had seemed so powerful, so entrenched, simply collapsed. There was no fascist resistance. No black shirt legions rose to defend their douche. No party faithful stormed the villa where he was held. Instead, crowds poured into the streets celebrating. In Rome and Milan, in every major city, people tore down fascist symbols. The bundles of rods and axes, the fasces that had given the movement its name, were ripped from buildings and smashed. Portraits of Mussolini were torn from walls. Party headquarters were ransacked. 21 years of dictatorship ended in a single day, and nobody lifted a finger to save it. That tells you something profound about how hollow the whole edifice had become. Fear had kept people in line. But fear evaporates quickly when the fearsome thing is suddenly gone. But the story, of course, didn't end there. If anything, Italy's suffering was only beginning. Badoglio's government found itself in an impossible position. They wanted out of the war, but Germany still occupied much of the country. So they negotiated in secret with the Allies, trying to arrange an armistice while keeping the Germans in the dark. The armistice was signed on September 3rd and announced on September 8th. The Italian armed forces were told to stop fighting the Allies and resist the Germans. But there was no real plan, no coordination. German forces, anticipating this betrayal, had been quietly reinforcing their positions in Italy for weeks. The result was chaos. German troops quickly occupied Rome and most of northern and central Italy. Italian military units, caught off guard and given contradictory orders, were disarmed wholesale. Hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers were shipped to Germany as prisoners. The Italian fleet sailed to Malta to surrender to the British. The king and Badoglio fled south to Allied protection. And Mussolini? In a daring commando raid on September 12th, German special forces rescued him from his mountain prison at Gran Sasso. Hitler installed him as the puppet leader of the Italian Social Republic, the so-called Salo regime, in northern Italy. For the next 20 months, until April 1945, Italy endured civil war. Partisans fought fascists, brother fought brother. The Germans treated Italy as conquered territory, stripping it of resources, deporting Jews, shooting hostages. When Allied forces finally drove north from Sicily, they faced fierce German resistance. Italian cities were bombed by both sides. Rome was spared street fighting through delicate negotiations, but Florence, Monte Cassino, and dozens of other places were devastated. Italy, which had entered the war hoping for glory and empire, ended it occupied by both sides. Its cities in ruins, its people starving, its young men dead or scattered across prisoner of war camps from Texas to Siberia. And what of the men who gathered in that room on the night of July 24th? Their fates varied wildly, as fates do in times of upheaval. Dino Grandi, the architect of the vote, fled to Portugal as soon as he could. He lived there in exile, writing his memoirs, insisting to anyone who would listen that he had saved Italy. He died in 1988, an old man who had outlived almost everyone else from that night. Galazzo Ciano wasn't so fortunate. After the armistice, he was trapped in northern Italy. The Germans handed him over to Mussolini's Salo regime. In a trial that was a farce from beginning to end, he was convicted of treason, the charge being that he had supported Grandi's motion. On January 11th, 1944, he faced a firing squad in Verona. His wife Etta, Mussolini's daughter, begged her father to spare him. Mussolini refused. Some said he was following German orders. Others said it was revenge for betrayal. Etta never forgave him and fled to Switzerland with their children. Giuseppe Bottai survived by going into hiding. After the war, his detailed diary became one of our most important sources for understanding the regime's inner workings. He lived until 1959, long enough to see Italy rebuild. Roberto Farinacci, the hardliner who had opposed Grandi's motion, stayed loyal to Mussolini's Salo Republic. In April 1945, as the Germans collapsed, he was captured by partisans and executed on the spot. And Mussolini himself? His end came on April 28, 1945. Captured by communist partisans while trying to flee to Switzerland disguised in a German greatcoat, he was summarily executed along with his mistress, Clara Petacci. Their bodies were taken to Milan and hung upside down from the girders of a gas station in Piazzale Loreto, the same square where fascists had displayed the bodies of executed partisans months earlier. Crowds gathered to spit on the corpses, to kick them, to photograph them. It was a brutal end to a brutal chapter. Looking back across the decades, what can we learn from that night in July of 1943? Perhaps this: power is more fragile than it appears. For 21 years, Mussolini seemed unchallengeable. The state, the party, the military, the police, all seemed to bend to his will. And yet, in one night, in one vote, it was over. The spell was broken. Those men in the parrot room weren't heroes, not in any simple sense. They weren't principled Democrats who had always opposed tyranny. Most of them had built their careers on fascism, had enjoyed its fruits, had looked the other way during its crimes. They acted not from moral awakening, but from fear. Fear that Italy would be destroyed, fear that they personally would go down with the ship. But they did act. When the moment came, when they had to choose between the man and the nation, enough of them chose the nation. History doesn't always give us the heroes we like, only the ones we get. The vote didn't end Italy's suffering. In many ways, it prolonged it. The 18 months between the armistice and final liberation saw more destruction, more death, more bitterness than anything that had come before. The country was torn in two. Families were divided. Old certainties evaporated. But the vote did mark the end of fascism as a governing system. After July 25th, there was no going back, no restoration. The sallow republic was a German puppet, nothing more. When Italy emerged from the war in 1945, broken and exhausted, it emerged as a democracy, imperfect, chaotic, but genuine. We who look back from the 21st century can see patterns that the participants couldn't. We know how it ended. We know that the dictatorships fell, that democracy survived, that Italy eventually rebuilt and prospered. But on that stifling night in Rome, none of that was certain. The men in that room were making choices without knowing the outcome, acting in darkness, hoping they were doing the right thing. That perhaps is the most human part of the story. History isn't made by people who see the future clearly. It's made by people stumbling forward in the dark, trying to do what seems right with incomplete information and conflicting loyalties. The night of July 24th, 1943, reminds us that even the most solid-seeming powers can crumble, that individuals do matter, that choices have consequences, and that the end of one nightmare can be the beginning of another, but also eventually of something better. If you found this journey into one of history's pivotal nights worthwhile, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel. Each week, we explore these lesser-known turning points of the 20th century, the moments when history pivoted, when ordinary people faced extraordinary choices, when the future hung in the balance. Thank you for joining me. Until next time.